Okay. So we are looking at Forex correlation. And then we said we want to take a case study of the Canadian dollar. Okay, card. Okay. So we want to take a case study of the Canadian dollar. And then we said that there are things that we have to recognize or note as regards the Canadian dollar. So that if you are trading the Canadian dollar, you know what to expect and how and things that affects the Canadian dollar. Is that okay? And then we said that we are going to take this case study because this is very pivotal to our understanding of fundamental analysis. So, number one we are going to look at is the Canadian dollar, and then under the Canadian dollar, we said that Canada majorly exports. Okay? Exports. And that exportation accounts for about 1/3 of their GDP. Okay? That exportation accounts for 1/3 of their GDP, their gross domestic product. Okay, so that is it about Canada. And who did they export these things to? We are told that 85% of Canada's exportation goes to US. Now, Canada exports, the exportation they do accounts for about 1/3 of their GDP, and 85% of all the exports goes to US. And this is very important. What does it mean? It means, therefore, that US, whatever happens to United States will affect the Canadian dollar, because they are the people that buys more of their exports. Okay, so let me write it down, that 85%, okay, so 85% of their exports goes to US. So we are saying that what this means, therefore, is that whatever happens to US economy will affect the Canadian dollar. Okay, so whatever happens to US economy will affect the Canadian dollar. Number three. The third we are going to look at here is this, that Canada, or CAD, let me just use CAD as an abbreviation, the Canadian dollar, Canada operates with a budget, surplus. Okay? Canada operates with a budget surplus and trade surplus. Canada operates with a budget surplus and trade surplus. Okay, now what does this mean? It means that the Canadian government aims more than they spend. Okay, it also means that they export more than they import. That is the meaning of that. So Canada operates with a budget surplus and a trade surplus. In other words, they aim more than what they spend, and two, they export more than they import. Now, you understand the mechanism behind their economy. They major on exportation. And what they export, 85% of what they export goes to the United States. And so as a result, their major mode of operation is that they operate with a budget surplus and trade surplus, which means they export more than they earn, okay? They earn more than they earn more than they spend, and they export more than they import. So that is the operation. So who do they export these things to? They export majorly to US. Okay, so now the US economy, therefore, will affect the Canadian dollar. So whatever happens to US economy will affect the Canadian dollar. So what means that whatever news that affects US will affect Canada. Now you see the correlation. Okay, so whatever news, whatever thing or a decision, an economic decision, policy that affects US will definitely affect the Canadian dollar. Okay, I repeat again, they export, they measure on budget surplus and trade surplus. They export more than they import, which means that they actually, the government earns more than it spends. So, and I said that 85% of what they export goes to US. Okay, so that is that. Again, one major thing again is that the Canadian dollar or Canada itself has a positive correlation with the oil. Positive correlation with oil. Okay? Yes. Canada has a positive correlation. The Canadian dollar has a positive correlation with oil. In other words, if oil increases, the Canadian dollar also rises. If the price of oil rises, the Canadian dollar also rises. If the price of oil drops, the Canadian dollar also drops. So one of the things you can check is the price of oil. Is oil increasing? If oil is increasing, then I can buy Canadian dollar because it will positively affect the Canadian dollar. But if oil is depreciating in price, the Canadian dollar will also be depreciating in price. Okay? So they positively correlate. So two things, oil and the US economy is what affects the Canadian dollar. Okay? Oil and the US economy is what affects the Canadian dollar, because the US economy is what absorbs a larger percentage of the exportation, and then the economy or the Canadian dollar has a positive correlation with oil. Okay, that means that whenever oil prices rise, the Canadian dollar also rises. Whenever oil prices drops, the Canadian dollar also drops. Okay, does that make sense? Please, if you can hear me, just type in yes. If you can hear me, just type in yes, please. Okay, if you can hear me, just type in yes. All right, nice one. So we are looking critically about the Canadian dollar. Now we said that Canada has what? A positive correlation with oil. Now let me tell you a little about Canada as regards oil. Canada is the world's largest 14th largest producer of oil. Let me write that down so that this in there you understand why the positive correlation coming. Okay, Canada is the world 14th largest producer of oil. Okay? So Canada is the world's 14th largest producer of oil. So what that means that the Canadian dollar has a positive correlation with oil. So whatever happens to oil will affect the Canadian dollar. Okay? And if oil prices rise, the Canadian dollar will rise. If oil prices drop, the Canadian dollar will drop. So one of the ways to map out the Canadian dollar is look at oil prices. Whatever affects oil price will affect the Canadian dollar. Okay, and again, look at the US economy. Whatever affects the US economy will also affect the Canadian dollar because US absorb 85% of their exports. Okay, does that make sense? So that is about Canada. Okay, that is about Canada. All right. So when you are looking at things, so when a fundamental news comes out, okay, as regards Canada, you should also put an eye on any information or fundamental news on US or on oil. Okay, because if the Canadian news comes out and then you look at a negative news on US comes out that affects the economy, or a news on oil comes out that drops oil prices, it will affect Canadian dollar. Okay, so that's it. Sometimes there might not be news on the Canadian dollar or fundamental news, but there's a news on oil that oil prices is doing well, it's rising by Canadian dollar because it will positively affect Canadian dollar. Yes, is there any question, please? All right, nice one. Okay, so let's go ahead. Okay, so we have critically looked at the Canadian dollar, that oil and the US economy is what affects the Canadian dollar. Is that okay? So I should be putting my eyes on the price of oil. If OPEC gives any verdict or whatever on oil, if it affects oil positively, I should look towards buying Canadian dollar. If it affects oil negatively, I should look towards selling Canadian dollar. Is that okay? And then I should also put my eyes on the US economy, because whatever affects the US economy will definitely affect the Canadian dollar. Is that okay? Now, that is that about the Canadian dollar. Let's go a step further to check on the Japanese yen. What affects the Japanese yen? Is that okay? Are we set for today's class, please? That's why I said just sit tight and listen carefully, because I'm taking details to explain these particular currencies and what affects them. Because it is mandatory and very important to know what affects these currencies and how these currencies behave in the face of oil rises, oil price rising or dropping, and how it affects, even particular economy affects the currency of another country. Okay, like we have seen now that the Canadian dollar has a close connection with the US economy. Okay, we have also seen now that the Canadian dollar has a positive correlation or positive connection with oil. Okay, because they are the 14th largest producer of oil. Now let's go down to Japanese yen. The yen of Japan. Japanese yen. Okay, the Japanese yen. Now, what affects the Japanese yen? Number one, now you got to understand something very important here, that Japan has very little energy production. Okay? Let me just put it this way, that Japan doesn't have oil. Okay? Most of their oils, okay, they import. Do you get me? So Japan has very little energy production, imports most of their oil it uses. All right. So Japan doesn't have anything to do with oil as for production. So what Japan looks at majorly is to import oil for their use. Okay? So which means, what does that mean? If oil prices drop, the Japanese yen do well. If oil prices rises, the Japanese yen drops. Does that make sense? So if I want to buy the Japanese yen, I should look at oil price. If the oil price is rising, let's say they are selling a barrel for $31. I'm just giving an example. And then the price of oil rises from $31 to $50 per barrel. It will affect the Japanese economy. Why? Because they import oil for their use. They don't produce oil. So the Japanese yen will begin to drop as a result of an increase in the price of oil. So what I was trying to say is that number one, let's look at it. Let me write it down. Okay, that Japan Japan has very little energy. Okay, little energy production. So Japan has very little energy production. So, right, full stop. Now, the next thing is that it imports most of its oils. Okay? Yes, it imports. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is this. Now, Japan, number 2, is an exporting country. It's an exporting country. Okay, Japan is an exporting country. So what does that mean? So, right? So the Bank of Japan, BOJ, you must have seen that in Forex Factory. The Bank of Japan, because every exporting countries, their currencies are very strong. Every exporting country, like we look at Canada, Canada is an exporting country, their currency is very strong. Japan is also an exporting country, their currency is also very strong. So what the Bank of Japan does is their major aim, their active aim is to ensure that their currency does not become too strong. Okay? Yes, their currency does not become too strong. And it does that by either increasing or decreasing their interest rate. Every exporting country, the major aim of their central bank is to ensure that their currency does not become, or it's not too strong, does not become too strong rather, okay? And so they try to adjust this by looking at whether they can decrease interest rate or increase interest rate, okay? So Japan is an exporting country, that is it. And then we are saying again that Japan has little energy production, so they import most of their oil. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Japanese yen has a negative correlation with oil. Do you understand that? So if oil prices rises, the Japanese yen also what? Drops. If oil prices drops, the Japanese yen increases. Now, let's look at number 3. Number 3, the Japanese yen is looked at as a safe haven. Safe haven. What does that mean? When we say something is a safe haven. Safe haven. Now, whenever a particular country is undergoing political instability, okay, the Japanese yen seems to rise. For instance, as of last year, during the time of US election between Trump and Biden, the Japanese yen rose. Why? Because whenever investors see political instability in a country, they seem to withdraw their their money and invest in a country that is politically neutral. So most times they withdraw their money and invest in countries like Japan. So whenever any country, most of these exporting countries are having any political instability, where the investors run to is the Japanese yen. Okay, so that is why it is looked at a safe haven. So most time when a country is undergoing a political instability, you will see that the Japanese yen is doing well. And when the country is undergoing a particular, a political instability or war, the Japanese yen is looked at a safe haven where investors can remove their money from that country and invest their money in the Japanese yen. So what are we talking about? Things that makes Japanese yen to rise is that number 1, when oil price drops, the Japanese yen will rise. 2, when there is political instability in any of these exporting countries, the Japanese yen will also rise. Okay, because the Japanese yen or Japan is the world's largest creditors. Okay, so whenever there's instability, people will naturally go to Japan to get some funds or to hide their money there. Okay, so that is it. So Japan, two things majorly. Number one, oil price. When there's a rise in oil price, the Japanese yen or the Japanese economy will drop. And then number two, when there is political instability in any country, the Japanese yen will rise. So take note of that. Okay, is there any question, please? Any question, please? Or if you can hear me, just type in yes, please. Any question? So we have looked at the Canadian dollar. We have looked at the Japanese yen. What affects the Japanese yen? Yes. If you have any, okay. Where do we get the latest and more reliable information on oil daily? And what time of the day do we look out for such? Okay, news from Ekere Charles to oil. Okay. All right, Brenda, you can go to Bloomberg. Okay. Yes, you can go to Bloomberg. You can also go to investing.com. Is that okay? We have to get latest news or reliable information about OPEC. You can go to investing.com or Bloomberg. Is that okay? Yeah, you can also go to Daily FX. Yes, you can also see information on oil there. Is that okay? Nice. Now let's go to Swiss francs. Let's go to Swiss francs. Let's go to Swiss francs. Okay? Swiss francs. Swiss franc. Okay. Now, Swiss franc, all of us know about Switzerland, right? Yes, we all know about Switzerland. Okay. Now, one thing about Swiss francs is that Swiss francs is a safe haven currency, just as the Japanese yen. Okay? Swiss francs is a safe haven currency. Why is it a safe haven currency? Because it is politically neutral. Politically neutral. Okay? Swiss francs or the Switzerland economy or the Switzerland, the Swiss francs or the Swiss francs currency is politically neutral. By that I mean, you could hardly hear about anything political that has to do with Switzerland. They are a safe place where any political action can be neutralized. Let me use that word. Okay, so what do we mean by being politically neutral? It means that whenever there is any political instability, the Switzerland franc or the Swiss francs rises. Now, any currency, let me tell you this, any currency that does well in the midst of political instability is called what? A safe haven currency. Because investors will remove their money from a country that is politically unstable and invest in that currency. Okay, like I've told you that the Japanese yen is a safe haven currency. Now, Swiss franc is also a safe haven currency. Okay, currencies that do well when there is political instability, they are called safe haven currencies. I repeat, currencies that do well whenever there is a political instability, they are called safe haven currencies. Like the Japanese yen is a safe haven currency, and the Swiss franc is also a safe haven currency. Okay, because investors want to remove their money from an economy that is politically unstable to invest in that particular country. Okay, that is why they rise whenever there is political instability. Okay, so that is that about the Swiss francs. Now, again, one thing you got to also understand is that Swiss francs or Switzerland is an exporting country. Switzerland is an exporting country. So as a result, the XNB, which is the Switzerland National Bank, what they try to do is to see how to control or to keep their currency so that their currency is not too strong. Okay, every exporting country like US, exporting country like your Japan, exporting country like Switzerland, the major aim or the major thing that their central bank, like the central Switzerland National Bank does, is to ensure that this currency or their currency is not too strong. And the way they achieve that purpose is to ensure that either they increase interest rate or decrease interest rate. When the currency is too strong, they will decrease interest rate. When the currency is too, too weak, they increase interest rate. That is how they regulate the strength of the currency. And there are some factors that determine whether they will increase interest rate or decrease interest rate. You know, our previous sections, we said what the bank does majorly is to bring about economic stability. Is that okay? Yes, to bring about economic stability. And so they watch over the currency so that the currency is not too strong and not too weak. So once the currency is too strong, they will think of decreasing interest rates so that the currency is a little bit weak. When the currency is too weak, they will think of increasing interest rates so that the currency is a bit strong. So this stability is what the central bank does. All right, that is what the central bank does. Now, again, one of the reasons again is that a large amount of the world's wealth management takes place in Switzerland. Okay, a large amount of the world's wealth takes place in Switzerland. So more than 25% of Switzerland's money is backed by gold. That is another thing again. So that is why now, so we want to know what affects the Swiss franc. Okay, so number one, political instability, because Swiss franc or Switzerland is a politically neutral country. Okay, so which means when there is political instability, Swiss francs will rise. That is one. Two, gold. Okay, we are told that 25% of Switzerland's money is backed by gold reserve. So what does that mean? It means therefore that when gold price rises, Swiss franc also rises. When gold price drops, Swiss francs also what? Drops. Is that okay? So you understand whenever the price of gold is on the increase or gold is buying, check Swiss francs. Swiss francs will also be buying. Whenever the price of gold is dropping, check Swiss francs will also be selling. And I also told you again that the case of the Canadian dollar, that the Canadian dollar also has a positive correlation with gold. When gold is buying, check Canadian dollar is also buying. When gold is selling, check Canadian dollar. So Swiss francs and Canadian dollar has a positive correlation with gold. Is that okay? So we have seen what affects the Swiss franc. That number one is a political neutral, and so political instability will increase. So sometimes you see US Swiss francs is selling. Perhaps there is political instability in a particular country, and investors seem to remove their money to invest in the Switzerland economy. So it begins to boost the strength of that economy. Again, gold. If gold is on the rise, Swiss franc also rises. If gold is dropping, Swiss francs also drop. Does that make sense? Knowing what affects each of these currencies. Okay. Are we good to go? Can you hear me, please? Just type in yes, please. If you understand, just type in yes, please. So the essence of this study is so that you know what to touch or information to gather that affects a particular currency, so that you don't just trade the currency alone. For instance, now you know that when oil prices rises, you know which currency it will affect. And when oil prices drop, you know which currency it will affect. Again, when gold price rises, you know which currency it will affect. When the price of gold drops, you know which currency it will affect. This is very important if you want to be a fundamental trader. All right. So can you hear me, please? Just type in yes. All right. Infinite Note 8. No wahala. I will send the video. Thank you. Okay. Next, we are going to look at Aussie dollar versus the New Zealand. Aussie dollar versus the New Zealand. Okay. So AUD and NZD. Okay, AUD and NZD. What affects the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar? Okay, that's what we want to look at today. We have checked that of the Canadian dollar. We have checked that of the Japanese yen. We have checked that of the Swiss franc. Now we want to look at the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar. What affects them? Okay, now number one, please take note of this. Okay, that Australian dollar and New Zealand are greatly affected by agricultural produce. Okay, what do we mean by that? We are saying that the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar are called commodity currency. Let me write it down. Commodity currencies. Okay? That the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar are called commodity currencies. Okay. Now, what do we mean? Exportation of agricultural products contributes greatly to their GDP. Okay? They deal more on agriculture. They export agricultural products. And this contributes greatly to their GDP. Okay? So because of agricultural products is what really improves their GDP, they are called commodity currencies. Do you get that? So they're based more on agriculture. This is what greatly improves their GDP. Okay. GDP. Okay. Now, again, Australian dollar has a positive correlation with gold. Now you get now. You see, Canada with gold. Okay. Swiss francs with gold. Now Australian dollar again with gold. So which means when gold rises, Australian dollar, Aussie dollar also rises. Now Japanese yen has a negative correlation. That is, if Japanese yen rises, gold drops. And if gold rises, Japanese yen drops. All right, you see the correlation. Okay, so Aussie dollar has a strong positive correlation with gold. Okay, strong. Let me write it down for you. Strong, positive correlation with gold. Okay, so what it means is that if gold rises, Aussie dollar rise. If gold drop, Aussie dollar drops. Okay, that's it. Now, why is it that it has a very strong positive correlation with gold? It is because Australian dollar AUD, okay, is the world's third world largest producer of gold. Third world. Okay, the third largest producer of gold. Okay, that is it. So it is the third largest producer of gold. That's it. So because of that, the Australian dollar has a strong positive correlation with gold. So you check out the price of gold. If gold is rising, Aussie dollar is also rising. If gold is dropping, Aussie dollar is also dropping. So we are looking at the things we should look at that affects different currencies. Okay? Yes. And if you look at the all center on this, oil, gold, agriculture, and exportation. Oil, gold, agricultural produce, and exportation. Canada exports, okay? Apart from export, gold. Is that okay? Japanese yen exports, apart from export, oil. Is that okay? Oil affects it. Then you come to the Swiss francs. Swiss francs, apart from export, another one is what? Gold. Now you come to Aussie dollar, okay? Agriculture and what? Gold. So you see, it revolves around gold, oil, agriculture and exportation. All right, now let's go further. Another thing that affects this commodity currency, that is AUD and NZD, is Chinese data or China. Okay? Yes. Why? Because most of the goods they export are produced by China. So whatever affects China will affect AUD and NZD. So when you are trading this particular Australian dollar, your eyes should be also on Chinese data that is released, because anything that affects Chinese their economy negatively will affect Australian dollar and New Zealand dollar. So your eyes should be on Chinese data. Okay, yes, and this is because of the close trade relationship between these countries and China. All right, so if the China economy is doing well, Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar will also be doing well. If there's an information or a news that affects the Chinese, it will also affect AUD and NZD. Does that make sense? Okay, that is why your eyes should be very close to what is going on China or the Chinese people about their products, because what the NZD or the New Zealand greatly exports are China products. Is that okay? So if China products becomes too expensive, it will affect the New Zealand dollar or the Australian dollar. If the China product is a bit cheap, it will also affect their the currency, the strength of that currency. So if China this is too expensive, what happens is, okay, so this country, their product also affects NZD. And this is because New Zealand exports a lot of their products. Therefore, whenever the price of their product is falling, so does NZD. When it rises, so does NZD. So you see, it possibly the New Zealand dollar or the Australian dollar positively correlates with the Chinese products, the prices of Chinese products. Okay, so as the prices of Chinese products rises, the New Zealand dollar also rises. And the prices of Chinese dollar drops, the New Zealand dollar also drops. Okay, so that means that your eyes should be on Chinese data when trading the NZD and the Australian dollar, because they are closely related. They do a close trade deals with the Chinese. Any question, please? Any question, please? Okay, for the Canadian dollar, I should come again with the Canadian dollar. Okay, for the Canadian dollar, I said, number one, that Canada exports account for 1/3 of their GDP. That's what I said. Okay, the exportation, the contribution of their exportation is 1/3 of their GDP. And we said that 85% of all the exports goes to US. That means that whatever affects US will affect Canada. Is that okay? Yes. Whatever affects US will affect Canada. Again, we said that Canada is the world's 14th largest producer of oil. So their economy is tied to oil too. So if oil price drops, the Canadian dollar will also drop. If oil price rises, the Canadian dollar will also rise. Is that okay? And we also said that the Canadian dollar has a positive correlation, with oil. All right? Which I've just explained that if it rises, it rises. If it falls, it falls. Okay, does that make sense? So Canada majorly looks at what is known as exportation and the price of oil. Okay, then we look at the Japanese yen. We said the Japanese yen has little to do with energy. Okay, so the Japanese yen majorly exports. So when there is the Japanese economy major on exportation, but it has a negative correlation with oil. So when oil prices rise, the Japanese yen drops. When oil prices drops, the Japanese yen rise. Okay, and again we said the Japanese yen rises whenever there is political instability in a country, because investors in that country want to remove their money to invest in the Japanese yen. That is why the Japanese yen is looked at as a safe haven. Is that okay? Then we shifted to the Swiss francs. We said the Swiss francs is also a safe haven because it rises whenever there is political instability in a country, because investors want to remove their money and invest in Swiss francs. Is that okay? Yeah, so when they invest in Swiss francs, Okay, in the midst of political instability, the Swiss francs will rise. So it rises whenever there is political instability. Again, we said that Swiss francs or the Switzerland is an exporting country. So the Switzerland National Bank, all they try to do is to maintain economic stability by seeing that the currency is not too strong and it's not too weak. Okay, that is what the bank does. So we also went a step further to say that the Switzerland economy is backed up with gold. Okay, yes, it is backed up with gold. So what that means is that the price of gold will affect Swiss franc. If gold price rises, Swiss francs will rise. If gold price drops, Swiss francs will drop. Is that okay? Then we take another step further to look at AUD and NZD. We said Australian dollar and New Zealand dollar, they are both called commodity currencies. In other words, they export more of agricultural produce. That is what measures their exportation. Is that okay? And again, we said that Australian dollar has a strong positive correlation with gold. Why? Because the Australian dollar is the third, or the Australian economy is the third largest producer of gold. So if gold price rises, Australian dollar rises. If gold price drops, Australian dollar drops. Okay, so you can check what is happening with Australian dollar with gold. Is that okay? And again, we said that the Chinese economy affects NZD and AUD. Why? Because the Australian dollar, Australia and New Zealand export more of their Chinese products. Okay, so if Chinese products rise, the price of the New Zealand dollar also rises. If Chinese product drops, their price also drops. Is that okay? So especially the New Zealand, we are told that products at the New Zealand export a lot of products from China. Okay, whenever the price of this product is falling, the New Zealand dollar will also fall. And whenever the price of these China products are rising, the New Zealand dollar will also rise, because they have a very close ties with the Chinese or the China people as regards their trading. So they export more of the Chinese products. So that is why if there's any Chinese data, fundamental data that comes out that affects the Chinese economy negatively, it will affect New Zealand. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that now you are not just looking at these particular currencies, you are now seeing what affects these currencies. And sometimes why this currency behaves this particular way. So you understand, sometimes there might not be fundamental news on that particular currency, but oil prices rise. You now know when oil prices rise, which currency it will affect. Okay, you now know that if Chinese products are on an increase, which currency it will affect. Okay, you now know if there is political instability, which particular currency it will affect. Okay, so these are the reasons, and these are the things, and these are what fundamentalists know, and they try to analyze. They now know that, okay, this country has political instability, definitely this particular currency will begin to do well in the midst of political instability. So that is the reason for this particular study, to know about what is known as correlation, currency correlation. Okay, what affects this currency and that currency. This is very important and very pivotal in our understanding of fundamental analysis. Please, ladies and gentlemen, today's class, I'm going to upload this video, go over it again and again, and understand this particular study very well, so that when you are doing your analysis, and in case you hear about OPEC news via your investing.com or Bloomberg or your FS Street or your daily FX, you can now ascertain which particular currency will the price in oil affect. Or you see gold rising, you will now know that if gold is rising, this particular currency and this particular currency will be affected by the rise in gold. So this is very important, so that you know the interconnection of these currencies to other currencies and other economic products. So this is very important. So please go over this study again and again and again. Please, if this study makes sense, just type in yes. Thank you. If this study makes sense, just type in yes. All right. And any question, please? Any question, please? Any question, please? Thank you. If you have a question, just place your question so we'll look at it. I will upload the previous class and this one alongside, so don't worry. Okay. Yeah, if OPEC rises oil prices, now that means that the Canadian dollar, if OPEC rises oil price, definitely, it simply means then that we are going to look at the Japanese yen first. Because if oil price rises, it will affect Japanese yen. So Japanese yen will begin to sell in the midst of oil price rising up. Do you get me? Yes, it will begin to sell in the midst of oil price rising up. Again, the Canadian dollar, okay, will be rising in the midst of oil price also rising. Is that okay? So while Japanese yen is selling, okay, if oil price rises, Canadian dollar is rising, Japanese yen is selling. Thank you. So please go over the study again and again, and see you guys next week, same time. Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.